The flashlight beam cuts a slow, trembling arc across the dark. Dust lifts in a narrow column where boots have already passed. 2, 3, 4 of them, until the light rests on something that does not belong in the night. A bare patch of churned earth, shallow and ragged. Someone kneels. Another light finds a hand, the flesh gone from the fingers, a bone half exposed. You can hear the officers breathing, breath fogging in the cold. Someone says quietly in Spanish, "Dios mío." The smell is the first thing that hits you when you are close enough, a metallic, stale stench that hangs low over the weeds. They follow it like a trail. It is late on a ranch road outside Matamoros, the kind of flat, scrubby place where the border feels less like a line and more like a weather pattern. Flashlights swing, boots crunch, and one by one, the shallow graves reveal themselves. 1, 2, 3, and then a loop of rope, a rusted cauldron, candles burned down to nubs. On a stick, something dark and wet hangs. Later, in daylight, it will be identified as animal remains. Close by, a crudely carved wooden bowl blackened inside. For the officers there that night, there was no story that fit everything they were seeing. It looked like a drug hideout. It looked like a ritual site. It looked like something older and meaner and beyond the ordinary. And then a name surfaces. A young American college student, missing after a night out in Brownsville. Among the bodies is a face that will be matched by photographs back in Texas, and suddenly this remote place has a headline that reaches across an international border. Narco-Satanists. The word will appear in newspapers, scream on television screens, and then lodge itself in the public imagination. But names will drift, details will warp. What was found at Rancho Santa Elena will be told and retold until the line between fact and fable is fuzzy. This is where we start. I'm Elena Marquez. This is Still Unanswered. We tell stories that want neat endings but rarely get them. Cases that are stranger and messier than the tidy narratives pressed on them. Today, the case of Adolfo Constanzo and the group the press called the Narco-Satanists. Ritual killings, drug trafficking, and a ranch outside Matamoros that became a place where belief and brutality collide. This is not a dive into satanic panic. It is an attempt to look carefully at what actually happened, what was likely ritual belief, which parts were probably practical violence dressed up as ceremony, and what we still don't know. We will follow a missing student, a border town's nightlife, a drug operation that bled into a makeshift shrine, and a leader who promised protection in exchange for loyalty. We'll speak to the evidence, to trial testimony, to the social realities of the borderlands in the late 1980s, and to the longer histories of Afro-Caribbean and folk practices that were part of how this group explained the world. And we'll keep returning to the victims, because these were not symbols on a sensational page. They were people with names, families, plans. Their deaths are the center of this story. Before we go further, a note about language. Throughout this series, we'll use words you might have heard in media coverage, cult, Satanist, narco, but we'll try to keep them tethered to evidence. The term that's stuck in the press, narco-Satanists, tells you as much about how journalists and police wanted the story to be simple as it does about what actually happened on that ranch. For much of the reporting, the occult pieces made for better copy, and for some investigators, they made the case feel explainable. An evil cult led by a charismatic sorcerer practicing human sacrifice. Those parts are true in some measure, but they are not the whole truth. To help us unpack the hard facts and the murkier territory around belief and violence, I'm joined by Dr. Javier Salgado. Javier is an anthropologist who spent decades studying Afro-Caribbean religions, folk Catholicism, and how those practices overlap with organized crime in the borderlands. He has researched rituals, court records, and the cultural context that got flattened into headlines in the late 1980s. Javier, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Elena. It's good to be here. This case, it's one of those where the facts are horrific, but the way people talk about it often makes things worse. We have to hold horror and nuance together, which is hard.
Exactly. And I want to start by grounding listeners, because for many people, the first image they'll have is a sensational one: candles, skulls, a man in black robes. But behind that is a real person who went missing and whose name would make this case impossible to ignore: Mark Kilroy. Javier, can we tell his story?
Yes. Mark Raymond Kilroy was a 21-year-old pre-med student from San Antonio, Texas. He had come to the border for spring break in March 1989. Young, bright, a typical student, his family remembered him as serious, with plans for med school. He disappeared after a night out in Brownsville, which is the U.S. town that sits opposite Matamoros in Mexico. Twin cities divided by a thin line, but connected by people, routines, and economies. His disappearance, when it became clear he hadn't simply gotten lost, mobilized both sides of the border in a way few other cases did.
Right. Picture Brownsville at night then. Bars full of college kids, neon signs, the noise of Spanish and English overlapping. For Texas students, it was cheap, close, and for many of them, freedom for a weekend. Mark went out with friends. They remember him stepping away from the group for a bit, an everyday scene that turned terrifying when he didn't return. At first, friends thought, he'll be back. At 2 a.m., maybe later, the mood changed. Calls home were made. By morning, there were posters. His disappearance attracted national attention, and that attention kept pressure on Mexican authorities to find him. So, how did the investigation go from missing person to a raid on a ranch outside Matamoros? It wasn't a straight line. Tell us, Javier.
Investigations on the border in that era were messy. Limited resources, competing jurisdictions, local politics. In Mark's case, the breakthrough didn't come from a single heroic detective moment, so much as a series of small leads. There were arrests related to drug shipments and low-level trafficking, and during those arrests, some officers started to hear rumors, strange rituals, a man who offered protection to criminals through spiritual means. The tipsters were not always reliable, but the smell of something else, someone's story about a ranch, kept surfacing. Eventually, a coordinated operation followed those leads to a place called Rancho Santa Elena.
Which brings us back to that night on the ranch road. When police arrived at Rancho Santa Elena, they found a site that was at once clinical and chaotic. A shack splattered with stains, a cauldron, later described in court as a nunga, and grave pits. They cataloged animal parts and what appeared to be ritual paraphernalia: sticks, chains, black candles. They also found drugs, weapons, and evidence that the place had been used as part of trafficking operations: makeshift laboratories, packages, radios. The scene was not tidy. And then they started uncovering bodies.
Correct. They found multiple shallow graves, sometimes bodies partially buried, sometimes fully exposed. Forensic identification at the time was limited. Some victims were identified by association, clothing, ID found nearby. Others were tentatively matched by family members through photographs. The most high-profile identification was that of Mark Kilroy. His remains were found and matched to photographs his family had provided. That fact is what shifted this from a tragic local story into an international one.
There are a lot of details people remember, and some that became myth. For example, the image of a boiling cauldron with things in it. Reports called it ananga, which is a term from Afro-Cuban and Afro-Caribbean traditions, sometimes used in Palo Mayombe. Javier, can you explain briefly what ananga is and how this concept was used by both investigators and the media?
Anganga is, at its core, a sacred iron cauldron used in several Afro-diasporic religions, Palo in particular. The nganga is considered a living repository of spiritual force. It contains earth, sticks, bones, hair, sometimes the remains of animals, and is tended to over time. Importantly, nganga is not inherently evil. It's a ritual object, like any altar or icon. What happened at Rancho Santa Elena complicated things because investigators found an iron cauldron and objects that matched descriptions of nganga, but they also found human remains, and they associated the vessel with violent practice. The media then took the language nganga and translated it into satanic cauldron or devil's pot, which fed into panic.
So there was a real ritual object used in certain spiritual frameworks, and there was a crime scene where brutal violence had occurred. The two facts were true, but their linkage and interpretation became slippery. I want to go back and talk about the man at the center of the story, Adolfo Constanzo. How does someone like him take a nanga and turn it into a service for traffickers?
Constanzo was, in many ways, a salesman of protection. He presented himself as someone who could influence outcomes, stop bullets, make shipments come through, protect men in power. He offered what looked like spiritual services as a commodity to violent actors who were already inclined to believe in shortcuts, amulets, rituals for luck, and so on. His backstory matters. Born in the United States, raised between Houston and Mexico, he had exposure to different religious currents and learned ritual practices. Over time, he assembled an identity that mixed Palo Mayombe elements, Christian imagery, and his own invented rites. That syncretism made him effective. He could speak the language of faith to desperate clients and the language of intimidation to his followers.
We often try to think in categories: cult leader, narco, con artist. But Javier, in your reading, was Constanzo more of a sorcerer who found clients among narcos, or more of a narco who weaponized belief?
It's not an either-or. Constanzo functioned as both. For some clients, he was a spiritual intermediary, someone offering ritual protection. For others, and probably for himself, he was an organizer who used belief as a lever. The violence at the ranch suggests calculation, rituals that terrorized, that disciplined followers, that created an atmosphere where orders were obeyed without question. So he sold belief to narcos and used violence to transform that belief into obedience. The overlap between spiritual authority and material violence is what made him dangerous.
Dangerous and persuasive. Let's step inside a ritual night reconstructed from testimony, court records, and survivors' accounts, so listeners can sense what followers said they experienced without glorifying the event. Imagine a dim shack. There are candles, the smell of smoke, and something iron, maybe the nganga. People ring a circle around a central figure. The language is a mix of Spanish, a few ritual phrases, slang, and commands. Someone brings in an offering, first a chicken, then something else. The leader's voice is steady. The followers' faces are tense. Some are there voluntarily. Others are there because refusal looks dangerous. Court testimony from survivors describes an atmosphere that mixed genuine belief and fear. One witness described thinking, "If I disobey, he will punish me. If I comply, maybe I'll live." Another described how acts that started as symbolic escalated. An animal offering became a human body in the logic of the group. It's hard to know, and that's the chilling part. Were these people convinced, or were they terrified into participation?
Both elements were present. Social scientists who study high control groups and cult dynamics often talk about the gradual escalation of commitment. Small acts of compliance escalate step by step until those same people are capable of acts they would have once found unthinkable. Add to that the power dynamics of illegal economies. If you are a foot soldier in a trafficking network, you may accept ritual practices because non-compliance could mean being ostracized, killed, or set up. The ritual gives a cover, a metaphysical justification for what may be practical decisions about control and obedience.
And then, the killings. We need to talk about them carefully. The people murdered at Rancho Santa Elena were not all drug operatives. Some were captured for reasons that sound like offerings in court testimony. Others may have been killed because they posed a threat to the operation. In Mark Kilroy's case, the evidence suggests he was taken and used as a sacrifice in a ritual that's been described in various ways in testimony. We are not here to sensationalize his death, only to be clear about what the records show. From the reconstructed accounts, the abduction usually began with a lure, someone isolated at night, led away under false pretenses, or with force at the hands of men who had already been drinking and who were armed. Victims were transported to the ranch, at times blindfolded. Some were kept alive until the ceremony. In other cases, testimony suggests there was little pretense. People were killed quickly. The common thread is dehumanization, bodies treated as means to an end. It's brutal. And again, the victims were real people.
And I want to emphasize that not every detail from early media reports stands up. In the frenzy of coverage, police sometimes repeated the worst-sounding elements without caution, because they were shocked, because they needed to explain the horror, because they were operating in a moment of satanic panic in the U.S. and Mexico. So we have to separate what forensic evidence corroborates, what is supported by multiple independent testimonies, and what might be rumor or embellishment. In this case, there is clear evidence of ritual objects and human remains. There is clear evidence of drug activity. There are testimonies that some killings were presented as sacrifices. But the narrative that every killing was a ritual sacrifice performed for magic is not fully supported by the footage of evidence.
That tension between horror and overreach followed the investigation as it moved from Rancho Santa Elena to Mexico City and beyond. Authorities gradually closed in. Lower-level members were arrested. Informants emerged. The group's inner workings, once opaque, began to leak. Describe the final days, Javier. How did Constanzo's network unravel?
As with many criminal organizations, pressure from law enforcement and internal distrust unraveled the structure. Informants started telling stories about the leader's rituals and the locations of graves. There were arrests that cut supply lines and communication. The cult's members, some of whom had joined for pay or protection rather than belief, started to fracture. Constanzo and a few loyalists fled to Mexico City, where they hid in an apartment building. The final standoff, or what the official account calls the final standoff, ended with Constanzo's death. Reports suggest a follower shot and killed him, allegedly on his orders, to avoid capture. The exact motivations remain debated. Suicide by proxy, ritualized ending to leadership, or a desperate attempt at controlling narrative. What's unquestionable is the collapse that followed. Arrests of followers, including Sara Aldrete, who was called his high priestess in press coverage.
The image of Constanzo ordering his own death is arresting. It fits the archetype of the cult leader controlling the final act. But as you said, Javier, the details are contested. Some survivors said she, Sara, was deeply involved. Others later claimed she was manipulated and terrified. The trials that followed were messy in the courtroom and in the press. Let's talk about that media circus, because it shaped public memory. Newspapers ran photographs of ritual objects and grave sites. Television programs labeled the group devil worshippers. In the late 1980s, the U.S. was in the early throes of the satanic panic. Think daycare accusations, ritual abuse scares, and Mexico had its own anxieties about drug violence and occult influences. The story of a cult blending drugs and demons fit perfectly into existing fears, so it spread fast. But as a result, some reporting simplified or amplified the occult components in ways that may have obscured motive and context.
Yes, the media often prefers tidy, morally unambiguous narratives. Here are the villains. Here are the rituals. Here is the horror. It's compelling, but it can also be dangerous. For example, calling the group Satanists flattened a specific religious vocabulary into a catch-all around evil. That prevented a deeper public conversation about how certain spiritual practices are weaponized, how belief and coercion mix, and how socioeconomic conditions on the border feed possibilities for groups like this to grow. It also influenced how witnesses testified. When officials use certain frames in interrogation, "Do you worship the devil?" it can shape how people remember or report events.
Which raises an important question. How much of what we know about the rituals, the exact number of victims, and the motives comes from reliable evidence versus from narratives constructed by media and law enforcement? You've spent time parsing court transcripts and interviews. Where do the records leave us uncertain?
3 main areas. First, the number of victims. Official tallies are likely undercounts because some graves went unexamined, some remains were too degraded for identification, and some witnesses were unreliable or intimidated. Second, the degree to which killings were religiously motivated. Testimony indicates ritual language was used, but economic and control motives are also obvious. Third, the extent to which the practices at Rancho Santa Elena represented authentic Palo Mayombe, or a bricolage, a mixing of ritual elements repurposed to justify violence. There is evidence of nganga-like structures and ritual paraphernalia, but the patterns are inconsistent with the normative, community-based ritual life of Palo practitioners. Instead, what we see is a syncretic, highly instrumentalized practice.
Instrumentalized. Ritual used as a tool. That tool served 2 masters: to reassure clients they had supernatural protection and to terrify followers into compliance. But there's another layer: confessions and testimony. Under pressure, threat of torture, promise of leniency, or simply the shock of arrest, people say things that may not fully reflect reality. Some confessions were vivid, others contradictory. How do we weigh them?
We weigh them against corroborating evidence and the conditions under which they were given. A confession that names the location of a burial and leads police to a body is more corroborated than a confession that describes a lurid ritual without physical verification. Also, we look for independent witnesses. The problem is, many survivors recanted or their stories shifted because of fear or manipulation. That complicates legal outcomes and public understanding.
Which brings us to trials. Survivors, defendants, prosecutors, and police all brought different stories to the courtroom. Some defendants received long sentences, others less so. Sara Aldret became a lightning rod in the press, a woman described as the high priestess, and the spectacle affected how people thought about gender, power, and evil. Many who followed the trials left with more questions than answers.
Indeed, the courtroom is not a perfect truth machine. It's adversarial, strategic, and often shaped by public pressure. Prosecutors sometimes highlight the most sensational testimony to make a case. Defense attorneys try to present clients as coerced or mentally ill. The result is a patchwork record. For historians and anthropologists, that's why we triangulate: court transcripts, forensic evidence, independent witness interviews, and comparative cultural knowledge. Still, gaps remain.
Let's step back and try to map the layers for listeners. What was real, what was ritual, and what may be legend? First layer: crimes documented by forensic evidence. Graves, bodies, weapons, drugs. Those are the hardest facts. Second layer: ritual elements confirmed by objects at the scene. An iron pot, sticks, candles, animal remains. Those are real too. Third layer: the interpretive layer, the meaning given to those objects, the idea that every killing was a sacrifice performed for magic. And that's where we see the most slippage. Do you agree with that framing, Javier?
I do. And I'd add that the interpretive layer is where cultural misunderstanding runs wild. An object like nganga can mean a lot of things in different communities: protection, memory of ancestors, a point of contact with spirit. In the contrived context of Rancho Santa Elena, it was pressed into service as a symbol of power and fear. That's an important distinction because it changes how we think about culpability and cultural practice. Reducing everything to satanic cult makes for spectacle, but obscures the socio-economic and political conditions that allowed this group to operate.
Which leads to a question many of our listeners will have. Why there? Why then? The late 1980s border was turbulent, drug trafficking networks expanding, social services thin, and cross-border flows of people and money unpredictable. Places like Matamoros and Brownsville were simultaneously intimate and economically fraught. In that environment, a figure who promised security, whether spiritual or actual, could thrive. Add to that the glamorization of power among certain criminal subcultures. Rituals promising protection were an attractive commodity.
Yes, and also consider the scarcity of institutions people trust. When legal systems are perceived as corrupt or helpless, alternative authorities emerge: priest figures, healers, or leaders who claim special insight. In Constanzo's case, he presented himself as a kind of fixer. For the narco, he promised protection, and for the follower, he offered identity. That double role is classic in groups that blend crime and religion.
I want to talk about aftermath, how communities remember, and how the story echoes. In Matamoros, the ranch was a trauma, a scar. Families of victims continued to seek closure. Identification of remains took years in some cases. The story also fed a larger narrative about weirdness on the border. Stories about brujeria, witchcraft, and protections sold to traffickers kept circulating. Those stories have consequences. They can stigmatize entire religious traditions and the communities that practice them.
Absolutely. We see two dangers. One is cultural stigmatization, labeling Afro-diasporic practices as inherently violent. The second is institutional amnesia, where the symbolic aspects of the case envelope the very practical failures that allowed the crimes to happen: corruption, ineptitude, lack of cross-border coordination, and socioeconomic desperation. Both matter. The case also became a training anecdote for law enforcement, which is fine for learning practical lessons, but problematic when it's used to justify the profiling of spiritual practices.
And yet, the story persists in local lore and in rumor mills. Decades later, people still tell tales about hidden graves, about cursed land, about the ranch that no one wants to own. That persistence is part folklore, part unresolved grief. Families still search for answers. Some bodies were never recovered. Some questions linger about participants who vanished or who were never held accountable. Javier, what lessons do you think investigators, journalists, and listeners should take from this case?
Several. First, be skeptical of simple narratives, especially when they involve religion or culture that's unfamiliar. Second, interrogate sources. Why did a witness say what they did, under what pressure, and what corroborates it? Third, center victims in reporting. Sensationalism sells, but it re-traumatizes families and can misdirect justice. And finally, remember the social context. Poverty, cross-border inequality, and institutional failure create conditions for criminal religious hybrids to emerge. Addressing those prevents recurrence more effectively than moral panic. Those are practical steps.
Practical and humane. We have focused a lot on the criminal and the ritual, and understandably so, but I want to make sure we come back to Mark Kilroy's family. After his remains were identified, his parents became public advocates for their son, urging cross-border cooperation and calling for accountability. Their grief turned into activism. They didn't let his name be reduced to a headline. That human center is what keeps us honest. As we close, I want to revisit the title of our show, Still Unanswered. This case is emblematic of that phrase. It gave us dramatic images and a tidy label, narco-Satanists, but it also left a trail of half-answers. How many victims? Motive for each murder? The full extent of Constanzo's network? The complete truth about Sara Aldrede's role? Histories of interrogation and trial mean that some statements were shaped by pressure, others by fear. So many pieces are missing.
And the unanswered questions matter because they change how institutions respond. If you assume the problem is purely evil cults, you fund witch hunts. If you see the problem as complex criminal economies intersecting with religious authority, you build different policies, better social services, careful cultural literacy in law enforcement, and cross-border investigative cooperation. The answers we don't have affect real-world choices.
So we end where we began, at a dusty ranch road with flashlights swinging. The place is quiet now. I went there, well, I went as close as I could. The land has been reclaimed by brush. Locals avoid the spot, or say the ranch has changed hands. Bones and tarps and the worst of human acts are gone or hidden, but the memory remains. That's what keeps people talking, the inability to put a period on the story. Before we sign off, a few of the big questions we still carry. How many victims were there, really? To what degree did followers believe they were doing sacred work versus obeying orders out of terror? Which killings were performed for spiritual reasons and which were convenient removals tied to drug business? How much did the cultural panic of the era color testimony and media coverage? There are pieces of answers in court files and in graves, but some answers, perhaps the most important ones, are lost with the dead and the frightened. Javier, any final thoughts for listeners who want to hold the horror of this case and also refuse to turn it into a caricature?
Hold both things at once. Be clear-eyed about violence and centered on victims, but resist the temptation to exoticize culture. Ask for evidence. Demand careful reporting. And importantly, push for institutions, law enforcement, border authorities, journalists, to be trained in cultural literacy, so they don't conflate unfamiliar ritual with criminality without proof. That's a pragmatic step with moral consequences. It's the least we can do for the people who suffered.
Thank you, Javier. And thank you to everyone who listened with the patience this case requires. Over the next episodes, we'll dig deeper. I'll speak with family members, with former investigators, and with scholars who've studied the legal aftermath. We'll try to follow the trail where evidence takes us and mark clearly where it doesn't. We'll also look more closely at the religious vocabulary and at how it was used and misused throughout the investigation and the media coverage. If you want to read the documents we referenced, court transcripts, newspaper stories, and some of the academic work that informed today's episode, head to our show notes. If you have tips or family stories you think are relevant, email us. We promise to approach every lead with care. This is work about people and memory, not spectacle. I'm Elena Marquez. He's Dr. Javier Salgado. This is Still Unanswered. Next week, we'll unpack Sara Aldrete's trial and try to disentangle her public image from the courtroom record. For now, good night. And remember, not all mysteries are solved by a single answer. Some persist because the world was always more complicated than we thought.